Welcome to the introduction of the Objects in the Box open source framework. The purpose of that video is to give an impression about the functional capabilities and the intended use. I will do that using the Objects in the Box standard user interface, and we will simply set up an own example project, and using that I can show all the functionalities provided by that framework. After setting up an Objects in the Box project and using the standard user interface coming with the framework, you will see that login screen here. It's important to be understood that the usage of the backend services is mandatory, but the user interface implementation could be replaced by an own one, by a project-specific one. So there is a clear separation between the backends and the frontends. Objects in the Box is using a so-named headless approach, meaning all backend services are exposing RESTful APIs, and those APIs will be consumed by a user interface. The standard one is what you see here, and that is what we will be using for our project. How a new project can be set up, I will explain in a separate video, and there is also a bunch of documentation, system manuals and so on available. Let's now go for the first login. And by the way, that anonymous apps button underneath here, we can just ignore for the time being. The apps concept of Objects in the Box user interface I will explain later. The standard login after having a new project installed is admin. And after logging in here, my browser immediately shows that there is an issue with the password. Sure, having the password set to the same value than the login is not very secure. So let's first change the password. And by the way, the admin user we are using here, that is the initial user being set up in the system when installing a new project. How new users can be added, we will see in some minutes. So I go here to the settings, change password, put in the current password and change it to another value. So we're now logging out and logging in again. Using the new password, the warning is gone and we can start setting up the project. Before doing that, I want to explain a bit more in detail the basic data model and the basic concept of Objects in the Box. In Objects in the Box, it's all about assets. An asset represents an object to be managed by the system, and in the standard setup, those assets are being named systems and components. It's simple to change that naming just in case you want to manage animals or plants or whatever you want. Those assets can have relationships to each other, and those assets will have specific properties assigned, and later on you will see that those assets will be assigned to specific roles to limit access and so on, and therefore all the assets have to be derived from an asset type. Here in the standard setup, named systems and component type. Which relationships an asset can have to another one is specified here. Which properties an asset being of a specific type can have is defined here, and so on. And next important point here is to understand documents. A document represents a set of information being assigned to either an asset or an asset type. And also all those documents have to be derived from a document type. They cannot have relationships between each other, but they all need to be assigned to either an asset or an asset type. And like for the assets, documents come with a set of properties, each property being of a specific type and representing specific information. To make it more transparent how that concept will be used in practice, I have set up an example project representing a fictional company dealing with the production of plastic parts. Therefore, that company needs to manage injection molding machines of two types, the Bruma 3000 and the TXR. These machines can have robots installed on it. These robots can have gripper installed on it. And there are 4 robot types, but just one gripper type covering all the grippers. Independent of that structure here, there will be grinders to be managed, also bundled in one type, and pumps bundled in one type. Next are the document types being assigned to that structure here. First is the maintenance plan, and the specific topic within maintenance plan is that that is not being assigned to a specific injection molding machine or robot, but to its type, since the idea behind is maintenance plans will be common for each machine of the same type. So we have a maintenance plan which can be assigned to a molding machine or to a robot, not to the other types of assets here. Then we have the maintenance itself, representing a specific maintenance happened at a specific point on time. Those also can be assigned to either injection molding machines or robots, in that case to an asset, not to its type. And then there are tasks, remarks, repairs, and runtimes. The runtime data can just be assigned to the injection molding machines. The other documents here, they are common for all the different types. Going down to the level of the data model, you see that the gripper can have 3 properties: name, picture, and remark, and the gripper is being installed on the robots. Each of the robots are having the same properties, each of the robot types to be concrete. Its name, picture, status, and remark, and the status can be defect, in maintenance, stopped, and in use. The injection molding machines, our 2 types, the Bruma 3000 and the TXR, they have again a name and a picture. In addition, they have a site information, which can either be Atlanta or Munich. They have a status, like the robot, and a remark. So the only difference to the robot is the site information here. And then there are the grinders and the pumps. Also, they can have site information attached, status attached, very similar to the injection molding machine. And left side you see the document structure. The maintenance plan is just coming with one property, and that's a JSON structure containing the elements of a maintenance plan. So that is also an idea I will explain more in detail later on. The quite intense use of JSON objects as the type of properties in case it needs to be modeled a complex data structure. Then there is the maintenance object with the tag, the title, due date, status, and so on. The status can be of type open and closed. the task object, the remark object, the repair. Repair for the parts replaced is also coming with a JSON structure attached. The other data types are being primitives. Yeah, and the runtime information. And now let's go back to the program and see how that can be configured there. For setting up the project structure, I want to start with the document types. And by the way, as you see here, after a new project is being set up, the admin user has just access to the administration section. That makes sense since each project starts with configuring the content, the structure of the project, and that's happening in the administration. That can be extended just changing the privileges of the admin role. How that can be done, we will talk about later too. Create new document type. The user interface controls we are also ignoring for the time being. Also, that will be explained later. So it starts with the maintenance plan. We can pick a file representing then objects of that type, meaning documents of that type. The default language setup of objects in the box is German and English. That can easily be changed in the configuration, but with the disclaimer that if you want to add additional languages, first you have to introduce the respective translations. So in the system manual, it's being explained how that can be done, but by default, the available languages are German and English. And important to create the attributes, the properties. Here, as already explained, we just want to have one property that's also being named maintenance plan. And it's of type JSON object. It's mandatory and no multiple entries allowed. Multiple entries means it could be more than one maintenance plans being added to that property. It would then be a list of objects at the end, a list of JSON objects. For sure, that doesn't make that much of sense here. It could make sense, for example, if you want to add characteristics of a machine to just one property in form of a string or a tag, but it's not of a meaningful purpose here. And that's it. So you could now complain and say, why do we need to add a property maintenance plan to our document maintenance plan? Yeah, the reason is simply the document idea, the document concept follows the approach of having key values assigned in a document. So it's not possible to just assign a value without having a key. And therefore, we need to specify a key. We could have named it differently. But here, why not just naming it maintenance plan, since at the end it contains the maintenance plan in the document maintenance plan. So just that is the idea behind, not to confuse you. And as you see, we have created our first document type. The next document type is a bit more complex. It's the maintenance document type. And by the way, one important detail I haven't explained yet. The name we are giving here, that needs to be unique. And that's especially of importance when we later on want to address those document types, and same will apply for the asset types in code functions. what a code function is also what we later will talk about. So important to be understood, it needs to be unique, and it will be used when addressing certain document types, certain component types programmatically. Can pick a file again. And specify the attribute. It starts with the task. The idea behind that task property in our example scenario is that that should specify what had been done, and it should match with one of the tasks being specified in the related maintenance plan. Therefore, it's of type tag, and since we do not know yet which tasks will be defined in the maintenance plan, we do not want to define constraints here. It's mandatory and no multiple entries allowed. I already explained what it means. If you would pick that, it would be possible to add a list of tasks to that property here. Next one is the title. It's a string, also mandatory. The due date. As a date format, mandatory. The status. And if you remember what I have explained when talking about our exemplary data model, we have said that the status is a tag and it should just have the values open or closed. And so it makes sense to define a constraint here, since a constraint limits the values being valid for that property. And which constraints can be defined, that depends on the type. If I would pick a string here, for example, I could define a pattern. If I put a JSON object in, I could define mandatory properties to be contained in that object. But when using a tag, it's just the value list, and we would say open and closed. It's mandatory. We will add a description. It's a string. We make that optional. And the closing date. That's a date, and since there will not be a value included here as long as it's not closed, we do not want to make that mandatory. So, and now all the properties we have defined you can find in that list here. You could also edit the properties again, and they can be moved up and down. You see now the task is at second place. We can move it up. It's at first place again. This has a meaning since the properties will be stored in the database in exactly that order which you see here. And at least in the standard user interface here, when the properties being shown, they will be shown in exactly that order. And we have done our work. Since I do not want to bore you with showing the creation of all the document types here, it will repeatedly be the same procedure as you saw for the maintenance plan and the maintenance. I will come back in some minutes when I have created all the remaining document types. So the work is done now, and you see here the complete list of document types I have created. And by the way, I have just done a slight correction on the images of maintenance and maintenance plan. Something went wrong there, and I have corrected this. And if you wonder what's underneath here you can choose to edit a document type. Similar behavior you will see on all those kind of UI representations. I can create a copy of a document type. So I see all the values already being set, and I could now just say, let's name a test and let's give it an arbitrary image here. You see we have now our test with the same image, and I could also delete it now. When I have deleted something, I can go to the trash bin and I will find it here, and now I could either restore or finally delete. In that case here we will finally delete and it's gone. After having specified the document types, now the next step is to specify the asset types. So in the system setup here, the system and component types. First one is the gripper we want to set up. We do not need to specify a picture for the type of the gripper, since each gripper will have its own picture related, as we will see later on. And the gripper will have the following attributes. It's having a name attribute, of type string. It's mandatory. It's having a picture attribute. That is of type file. It's a file representing the picture, and there is no dedicated image type here. It's just the assumption that when we specify a picture attribute here, that has a specific meaning and it expects a picture to be represented by that file. We do not make that mandatory, since it might be that certain grippers don't have a picture related. And finally, it's a remark that is also of type string, and that is optional. So now we have specified our gripper. Let me now reopen the asset type we have just created, and you see that now all those menu items are enabled, which previously had been disabled. The reason is that some of those menus here are just being accessible after the asset type had been stored. Let's talk a bit more about documents now. Here in the Documents menu, you find two sections: Related Documents and Related Document Types. Related Documents specifies documents which are assigned to an asset type. So those documents listed or added here, they apply for all assets of that type. Related Document Types is about documents which can be added to an asset of that asset type. So that's about documents assigned to the asset type. That's about documents related to an asset. Here for the related documents, we will not add anything for the gripper. That comes later for other asset types. Let's have a closer look here. So here you find all document types listed which are specified for our system. And just documents of the type we are selecting here, they can later on be added to the asset of that type. And we will just pick those two here. The next asset type I want to create is the T-Star 9 3D robot, and since that also has a name, a picture and a remark contained, I can just go create a copy here, and you see some of those elements are already set. That I will change. So, and on the attribute side, I want to add a status attribute. Of type tag, should be mandatory, and also want to define constraints here. You know that from creating the document types, it's the same story here. It should consist of the status defect, maintenance, stopped, and in use. And I want to add that a bit more up. So remark should be last. Let's save it. And you know the story. When we go back here, and now we can add our document types. There is one significant difference between the documents assigned to a gripper and the documents assigned to a robot. Since for the robot, I want to specify maintenance plan. So the maintenance plan is defining which maintenance steps has to be done when, in dependence of the runtime of the robot, in dependence of a time window. So I can go here under the related documents, pick maintenance plan, say create related documents, and unfortunately I see here just the access identifier. An access identifier can be defined, it's not a must, it's a can, for later on in the program code addressing that, in our case, maintenance plan directly without searching. So I can then in a certain code function, which we will talk about later, directly specify an access identifier. So I could say here my plan, and that would then be my access identifier, and that document would get picked. But what I don't see here, unfortunately, is any user interface controls, which allow me to specify what my maintenance plan is about. And that is since the document type maintenance plan has no user interface controls assigned yet. How that's being done, I will explain in some minutes. For the time being, we will just cancel here and come back to that later. When going to the related document types, since we have copied our document, our asset type gripper, we see here already selected what had been selected for the gripper. So what we want to assign to is the maintenance itself, not the plan, since the plan belongs to the related documents, and the repair. And by the way, just thinking twice, I think I will also add the repair type to the gripper later on. That makes sense there too. And at the end, that's it. We can save it and we can continue. But before doing that, I want to explain another property of an asset type, and that's relationships. A robot will have grippers installed on it, and that's exactly the purpose of that relationship property here. It's about explaining the relationships of assets to each other. So I can here specify for that asset type robot which kind of relationships to other assets it can have. I go here to the create relationship type. I pick the gripper here, so I can pick here one or more asset types. And that means just assets of that type can get assigned to that specific relationship here. I name it has installed. That name here is important when later on via code functions one is accessing those kind of types or relationships. Has installed. Hat installiert. So, and here, by the way, it's also possible to specify whether multiple of those assets here can be added to that relationship or just one. If I want to have a one-to-one relationship or a one-to-many relationship. So I save that, and now that specific type of relationship is defined and can be used later on. For creating documents assigned to an asset, there are two ways. Either a document can get created using a code function. We didn't talk about that yet, that will come later. Or a document can get created using the standard user interface here, or an app. For that purpose, first, before a document can get created, the user interface controls used for creating a document need to be assigned to the respective document type. That is what we will do now when it is about the maintenance plan. We will go to user interface controls, and here you see two modes, either the element mode or the object mode. Object mode means that the user interface control we are choosing here will take care about the complete document. Whereas element mode means that for each of the properties of the document type, one specific user interface control is responsible for. For the maintenance plan, we will go with the object mode. And as you see here, for showing, editing, and searching, there are different components to be assigned. We will go with the show component first, and what you see here, that's pre-configured. How that configuration works is explained in the system manual and also in a video dedicated on how to configure that system. For the time here, we will take it as given. Maintenance plan view component is what we want to pick. For the edit control, it's the edit component, and search we just leave open. After saving the document type, now it's ready to go. But before assigning a maintenance plan to our robot, I will first go and show you how that works with element mode. You see here, I'm about to edit our remark, the user interface controls for that, and that time I want to do that in element mode. And therefore, here for the respective type of the property, specific controls are assigned. I will go here with the string show control. Same for the creator, the urgency, the description. Yeah, for scene we do not have anything assigned since that is a boolean. So that's left out. And if we want to display boolean values, we will have to specify a dedicated user interface control for that boolean value in the system settings. As said, I will explain in another section how that works. And for editing here, we have a string edit control. Text edit control is similar, but it's intended to create more long and dedicated text, so over multiple rows. Here we go with the string edit control. Also here, the urgency, it's a tag. And we could also say the priority control, but here we go with the tag. Text. And that should be it for the search control. For the time being, we will not assign anything. About the search mechanism, I will also talk about in one of the other chapters here. So let's save it. And now we could go to our system and component types. Pick the tester 3D, go to documents, and now I can assign here a maintenance plan. Therefore, I pick maintenance plan, say create related document, and now I could detail out all the tasks contained in the maintenance plan. And what you see here, that part of the user interface, that's being provided by the user interface control. We have just assigned an object mode to the specific document type, meaning to the maintenance plan document type. Can go now create here certain tasks, but to not bore you with all the details at that point of time, I will just leave that open. We'll save an kind of an empty maintenance plan, and when later on I show you how that maintenance plan concept works in our example, I will detail that out. So we have stored our maintenance plan here, and now the tester 3D is ready. We could use it. In the next steps, I will create the other robot types, but that's always the same. Therefore, I will skip that process and just come back to you after having that done. All the robot types are created now, and as you see, I do not have assigned pictures to any of those asset types. If we want, we could do that just by picking a picture, saving, and you see now we have the picture assigned. In the next step, I will continue with the injection molding machines. For the Broomer 3000, I will take one of the robots as the base for a copy. So now set up the name, the local names, and on the property side, we are almost complete. The only property which is missing is the site. That is intended to be a tag, and we want to set two constraints. One is Munich, and the other side is Atlanta. It's mandatory, and the so I did a typo here. and we want to move that one place up and save it. In the document section, I just want to add one document type, and that's the runtime data, since later on I want to be able to add runtime data to injection molding machines. And in the related document section, being related to the type, not to the separate assets, I want to add a maintenance plan. So the details we can fill out later. And that's it, and we can save. Save it. And the first injection molding machine is created. Now we can do the same procedure again for the TXR. Go here, create our maintenance plan again, and save it. We are almost done now with the asset types. Just the grinder and the pump is left. So I will take here the broomer as a base for the copy. All the properties should fit. The only thing I want to change here is the assignment of the related document types. For the grinder, we don't need the runtime data and we don't need the maintenance, since we do not have a maintenance plan assigned. And we can save. Let's go there. Yeah, this is also what we still need to change for all the asset types. I forgot to change that. We'll do that in a second. But here in that relationship we can delete anyway. So save it. And now I will take the grinder as a base for the pump. Save it. Go back here to the relationships, and here we need to change something. We need to create for both of the injection molding machines other kind of relationships. It's again named has installed. But instead of the gripper, we now want to pick all the different types of robots which can be installed on an injection molding machine. And doing the same for the TXR. So that is it now. We have defined all the asset types we need. We have also defined the document types and related the document types to the asset types. So in the next step now, I want to explain how to restrict, to regulate the access to the data. On one hand, to the documents, on the other hand, to the asset types and later on the assets, but also to specific system functionality provided by objects in the box, since the intent is not that each and every user can do everything in the system. We want to restrict the access to certain functionality. Let's see how that works. Before I will start explaining what I name the authorization concept of objects in the box, let's have a look at the fictional object structure, the fictional asset structure in our example project setup. So here in our example project, there are certain injection molding machines at the right side, some grinder, some pumps. They have a name and they have a site. So I skipped the other properties since they do not play a role for what I want to explain here. The site is kind of important. We'll see why. Then related to those injection molding machines, there are certain robots assigned with an has installed relationship, and the robots have gripper assigned, coming with a name. And then underneath here, I have explained certain types of users which at the end will have to interact with the project. First, there is the administrator. Administrator needs to have full access to all the features, all the objects. There is a service engineer belonging to an external company, and that service engineer or those service engineers will need to have access to the injection molding machines and the robots of the site they are responsible for. Therefore, here the site information is of importance. And then it's also mentioned certain apps. What apps are in objects in the box, I will also explain a bit later. We have the mechatronics technician who needs to have access to also the systems and components of his site, but in that case the access privileges, so which injection molding machines, which components he needs to see, will be derived by his related department. And then there are certain kinds of documents like the tasks, the maintenance documents, remarks and repairs. The mechatronics technician needs to deal with. By the way, also the service engineer needs to have access to the maintenance documents and the repair documents related to the machines he is responsible for. There's the mechatronics engineer who needs to be able to create read and edit tasks. Same for the maintenance documents, but here is just reading. Remarks he can create and read. Repair documents he can read. And then also important, he needs to have access and need to be able to create certain events. What events are is also explained a bit later. We have the machine workers. They need to be able to create remarks in case something is wrong with the injection molding machine they are working with. Also here, the injection molding machines they have access to will be determined based on the departmental relationship. They also need to have access to the grinder and pumps they are working with. And finally, then there is the manager, not creating information, but reading information. And also the manager finally will have access to certain apps. So that explains the overall constraints of our project. I'm back now in the Objects in the Box user interface, and for specifying the different types of users I was just explaining, I go to the role segment here, and you see there are already 2 roles existing. Those roles got created when initializing the project, and they can't be deleted. So you see here it's grayed out. It's not possible to delete one of those roles. And when you go inside the admin role here, you see the admin string is also not editable, and also the assignment of the administrator privilege can't be taken off that role. The reason is that that role is tightly bound to the admin user. You see also here that's not editable. The background is by having these admin roles tightly bound to the admin user and having the admin user not being deletable like the role too, it's ensured that at least one user in the system has the administrator privilege and can administrate the system. So that avoids from creating a situation to be locked out of the system when finally nobody has the administrator privilege any longer. That's the background of that. By the way, what you see here is that by default just the English strings are being defined. So let's define now the German representation of that role. Funnily, it's the same than in English. Save it. And what is now about these anonymous roles starting and finishing with an underscore? The intent of the anonymous role is that what's being defined here applies for usage of the system by someone not having a user account or at least not being logged in. So it's the anonymous usage of that application. Question is now, when can that apply? Since what we see here, that just be shown to users being logged in, but there is one specific aspect where user can use the system in an anonymous mode. Let's show you here. You see there is that anonymous apps button here, and when we push that, apps would be shown which can be used without a login. So we didn't talk yet about what an app is, how that's being used. So I would like to postpone this in-depth discussion for some minutes, but that's exactly the meaning of that role. That role, the privileges assigned to that role, will be used in the context of anonymous app usage, meaning apps being used by users not having an account or not being logged in. Let's give them also a string here, a German one. And yeah, now let's come to defining new roles, reflecting the authorizations that we have just specified for our exemplary project. It starts with pushing the create button here. I want to start with creating another system administrator role, and you might ask yourself why that's necessary, since as I explained a minute ago, there is already that default admin role defined in the system. The recommendation is to not use the default admin role for arbitrary administrative users in the system, but to keep that assigned to the admin user. When you want to assign different other administrators to the system, they should be assigned to a separate admin role. So let's name that sysadmin, system administrator, as the English representation, and in German it's the same. And now important is that in the privileges section, administrator is picked. That means that it's not necessary to specify dedicated access privileges to the system and component types, meaning to the asset types, or to the document types, since users having a role assigned that has the administrator privilege assigned, they by default get access to all the asset types and all the document types. So full access. When it is about granting access to specific parts of the standard user interface, then these additional privileges need to be picked. If in a certain project one decides to not use the standard user interface, but to create something new, it's possible to assign completely different privileges here. That will be explained in the system manual and in another video how that works. And then that is about granting access to specific functionality of the system. As said, when it is about granting access to asset types, what we name system and component types here, or to document types, then it's important to pick that privilege. That is not specific for dedicated user interface or system functionality. That defines if a user is having administrative privileges or not. So, and all those other things here, like access to user types, to apps, to events, that is what I will explain later on, but all that is being defined by the role assigned to a user. So let's say now create, and we see now we have our sysadmin user created here. Next role I want to create is the manager. So the name is manager. The language specific names are both manager2. On the privilege side, it's important to not assign the administrator role, since the manager is not intended to administrate the system, to manage the system, but to have the complete overview. So therefore, he gets access to the dashboard, to the apps, system components, and also the events. And for all our components, the manager gets read access right. You see now here that something is popping up. We will talk about that, which is an additional access filter, just in a minute, when talking about some other roles here. So we set read to all of the components. Same for the documents. And it's also by purpose here that you don't see that additional filter for the document types. Events, user types, not defined yet. Come back to that. Yeah, and now we have created the manager. The next role we want to deal with is the service engineer, and here things become more tricky. I've opened that picture here again, which explains what the service engineer should be able to do. And the important thing in here is the statement of his side. So the service engineer should be able and has to be able to have access to the molding machines and the robots of his side. What does that mean? When we see here how our assets are being structured, especially the injection molding machines, doesn't apply for the others, they have sites attached, Munich and Atlanta. It's just an example here in our sample project. So the idea behind is that there are several external companies being in charge of maintaining molding machines and robots of a certain site. So an external company doing service in Atlanta should not be able to access data for the equipment in Munich. And the question is now how to make that happen. The idea for that access management of a user to an asset is to create a relationship between the asset and the user, which allows for taking a decision whether a certain user is allowed to access a certain asset. The first cornerstone of that you will find in the properties we have defined here for our asset. That's the site property. The question is now how to relate that site property to a user. And here we come to user types. What is a user type? For understanding that, let's first have a look at what a user is of. When I create a user, there is just an account and a role assigned. So no name, no department, nothing but an account and a role. And authentication data. I will explain later on why it's separated authentication data from what's being named base data here. And there is a type. And currently the only type we have available here is base, which means it's just account and role. But what if I want to add a department, a specific company, or a site to a user? Then I can go with user types. So let's create a new user type. First, I want to give it a name. Service technician. Can pick a picture here, we leave it. And the same way we did for documents or asset types, I can create attributes here. And we will simply add 4 attributes. First is surname, it's a string. Let's make it mandatory. First name, a company, and a site. And the site we will make a tag. So having those 4 attributes designed here. Again, same story than with the asset types or the document types. It's possible to add user interface controls. And we can save. Now there is a user type service technician. When I now go and create the new user, in addition to the base type, I can pick the type Service Technician, the user type, and then a property section appears. And in that property section, you see all the properties we have defined for that specific user type, which got selected here. When I go back to base type, the property section disappears. But before we can go filling that out, we still need to create the Service Technician role. So let's cancel here and let's go back to the roles and create a Service Technician role. I name it Service Technician. By the way, if the names are the same, then for example a user type, that will not hurt, since whenever those names are being used in a code function, it's separated between the various classes and types we are dealing with here. So user types, roles, whatever. Privileges, so he should have in principle the privilege to see the dashboard and some apps and also the systems and components, not to the events. On the robots, it's the read privilege. On the molding machines, the same. Read, not to the pumps, not to the gripper or the grinder, but here to the next molding machine. We do not have access filter functions assigned yet. That will come next, but before doing that, we need to dive down into the details of how code functions work, since at the end a filter function is nothing else than a code function. So let's create first here the role, but we forgot to assign the access rights to our document types. Do we need it to the maintenance plan? No, not really, I think. It's sufficient for the maintenance, the tasks, the remarks, and the repair. That should work. Create. And now we have our Service Technician role created, and we can use that for defining a new user. But as said, before doing that, I want to explain the concept of code functions so that you have a chance to understand how our access filters work. In the Objects in the Box handbook, which you find under Documentation Handbook, there is an HTML version as well as a markup version stored. There is a dedicated chapter on code functions. And here you find a lot of explanations on what is static registration, what is dynamic registration, and all the different kinds of code functions and properties. But I do not want to bore you with all those theoretical details here. I will show you a bit more on code functions directly in our code and in the user interface. As already mentioned, code functions can be added to the system in two ways. Either dynamically, meaning by specifying them here in the administration section, or they can get added in a configuration segment of the source code. I will show you both. But before going into that, question is, what is a code function? A code function is simply a JavaScript programming language provided function which accepts some arguments and often returns a return value, which then has a meaning. The details on that you will find in the handbook. Not all code functions have to return a value, but a lot of them. And those code functions can get integrated in certain functionality here, like for the access filters. And if something in the platform occurs or is executed, the code function related to that might be executed. And when you want to see at a glimpse which code functions are available, you can click here. So this is the set of code functions available in that version of objects in the box. If you click on that asset access filter here, for example, now, and we say create code function, then that window opens and we have to give the code function a name and a language dependent meaning. And here we can go coding. I will not do that now, and just see here this other segment, code function failures. So it might happen that when designing a code function, programming a code function, there are some errors in some bugs. Those bugs will raise code function failures, which then get listed here. So if something went wrong, for sure, one should always already in the code be careful by catching errors using try-catch mechanisms, things like that. But something might happen, something might be forgotten, and then the code function failures here are containing those failed code function executions, and one can see what happens and why it happens. So might be later on we can try that out. But now let's go to the source code and see how statically integrated code functions look like. By the way, what I show you now is not intended to be used by an objects in the box administrator, but by the implementation responsible, the developer of a certain project. So when I go here to my backend services, I see there is a customizing section and there is code functions. And you see here a well-defined structure like asset access filter, filter by fabric. And that's, for example, the code function we will be using for our purpose. Even we are not talking about a fabric, but a site. We could rename that also to asset filter by site, but from whatever reason I had named it by fabric. It's fine. This code function here with that name is then imported in that code function definitions file. How that file works, you find in the handbook. At the end, it's quite simple. You see it's being imported here with its code function name. That is this one. It's being exported. And then it's registered as an asset exit filter, including a name, and that name is then being translated to a language specific name using the localization segment of the project here. So asset, it's not what you need to understand when aiming to administrate the system. it's for the implementer of the system. If one wants to add a code function which is not being defined here, it's not necessary to touch the code. You can go to the dynamic definition of code functions and do it there. But before going back to the user interface, let's have a closer look to the code of our code function here. As you see, it's just a single liner. What it does, the asset access filter accepts as the first argument a JSON object representing the asset, and as a second, the user properties containing the properties of the user type assigned to the respective user. And since we know that our asset has a site property and our user type for the service technician has a site property, we can compare, and if that comparison returns true, then access is granted. If it returns false, access is prohibited. So the return value of that function here, of an asset filter function, always has to be true if access is granted. If it's false, access is denied. This is how it works for other code functions. Let's take here an asset hook. You see here I have just added for test purpose a console logging, and return value doesn't play a role. There are others like a pre-create where the return value is of importance, since here I could in that function manipulate the properties of the asset, and then the returned asset properties will be taken for creating the asset. But as said, all that's being described in the handbook. Have a careful look at. If you deal with code functions, they're really powerful and create a lot of the configuration capabilities of the platform. Back in the administration user interface, I will reopen here our service technician role. Go again to the access rights on system and component types. And here I can add now the respective filter function. The filter function I have just explained with the site comparison just works for the molding machine, since as you might have seen for the robots there is no site property available. Access management, access filtering on robots will work a different way, since you might remember we have created a relationship between molding machines and the robots, and has installed relationship, and that is what we will use for finding out whether a certain robot is installed on a machine the user has access to, and just under those circumstances we will also allow access to the robot. But that code function is not available yet. We will have to program that later on. For the molding machine, I can take that by assigned location. That's what I have shown. Here is the other one. And now we have, for the molding machines, filter functions defined. Save it, and story is done. Now the system is configured so far that we can start creating the first systems and components, meaning the first assets. So I will pick first the gripper here. And by the way, you see here search related user interface controls appearing. These have to be specified in the user interface control section of an asset type, a system and component type. That is what you see here. If here nothing is specified, you see no field for the search filtering. So let's go back to the systems and components, create. So here we can put in a hypothetical serial number or whatever we want to use as the name of a gripper. Just take that. Can pick an image here if you want and create it. Next I will go for a robot, and you see now the available search fields here, they have been changed because of what I explained. That is specified, that field here, by the respective user interface controls assigned to the robot 45-2D. So here I will go for a serial number, and by the way, I think later on I will change that name string here to serial number. Under the hood we will keep the field named name, since the name field in the standard user interface is used to be represented in the icon. You will see that in a second, what I mean. Can pick an image again, a status, and go create it. You see here that's that Alex 42477. So that is being represented here. That comes with the standard behavior of the standard user interface. If one would like to change that needs an impact on the source code. So I can create another relationship here, and we want to relate it to our gripper. Close it, and it's done. When we go back here and go to relationships, we see our grippers assigned. And finally, I will pick an injection molding machine, create that. The status is also in use, and the site is Munich, created. And again here we can pick a relationship, and in that case it's the 2D robot. Save it, and when I go here to all systems, we see the 3 systems and components we have just created, and as we know, they are now related to each other. By the way, as we see here, it's not possible to delete a gripper. It's also not possible to delete a robot. It would be possible to delete the molding machine. Why isn't it possible to delete a robot or a gripper? Since these components are being used by another components, meaning they have a relationship from another component, from another system, to itself, and therefore it's impossible to delete that. That can be configured in the system, that behavior, and that's the standard behavior. So I do not want to bore you with looking at me creating all the components of the systems, all the systems and components. So therefore I will come back to you in some minutes. Here in the video, it will just be seconds after I have created all the other remaining systems and components, and then we can continue learning what the system is providing. So after a small jump in time, you see now all systems and components for our exemplary setup being created. And we could just pick one here, like that 3D robot. And you see also the relationships to other systems and components, or in other words, assets, have been created by me. So we see that this 3D robot has two gripper installed, and we also see that itself is referenced by the Bruma 3000 injection molding machine. And if we want, we can now also go creating documents here, like that task. So I can pick a type. It's a repair task. It's urgent. It's open. Please repair. Save it. Next, what we want to talk about now is events, since events are a core functionality of objects in the box. So let's see what events are. The idea behind events is the following. Instead of always changing assets manually, so for example, the status of an asset or characteristics of an asset, or creating documents related to an asset manually, changing those documents manually, it might be more efficient to react on when something happens in the platform. And this something, this is realized using events. So the idea behind an event is that something can be raised in the system, an event, and then based on that event, something will happen in the system. And that can be changing an asset, creating a document, and so on. In principle, kind of everything. There are two kinds of events available in objects in the box. It's manual events and triggered events. The difference is as follows. A manual event is always raised either by using the objects in the box user interface or a code function. And it's always raised on exactly one asset. So there is a one-to-one relationship between a specific manual event and a specific asset. Triggered events, they can't be raised from inside objects in the box. They are being raised using a specific API, which is called from outside objects in the box. So the idea behind here is that when something happens in the ecosystem, for example, some sensor data of a machine fire an event that there is a problem, this can be processed using that objects in the box API for raising a triggered event. And then the platform objects in the box will decide on which assets that event has to apply and will then raise some code function. By the way, it's the same here for the manual events. At the end, a code function is raised, and that code function is then doing something. So let's go through that step by step. Also, what an event issuer is. But I want to start with the manual event types. So let's first create one. I want to create a manual event type for creating remark documents assigned to a specific asset. So it's about this type of documents here. And by the way, I just want to change one attribute. I had named that scene. That's not best. I want to rename that to updated. No, to status. Let's name it status. And it's a tag. And I can even define constraints here. Open and closed. Save it. Save the document type. Now let's go back to the events. And what I need to do now is I need to create that type, give it a name, say create remark. And I need to create the attributes of that event. From the programmatic perspective, all those attributes assigned to an event will finally create JSON objects, so key value pairs, and that's the way an event is represented. I will start with the creator ID here. So it's the usual story. Goes on with the creator. The urgency. I will have to have a look which kind of urgencies we had defined so that we can make that matching here. Let's make it a tag already. And finally then the description. Which is a string. So, and here there are two more attributes. First one is a decision whether that event should be saved. So then we can always see which events had been raised on an asset. For events which might happen regularly within minutes or even seconds, that wouldn't make sense. It would be too much events to be stored. There I would not save it. If I decide to save, I can also say after which period of time, after how many days the respective event should be deleted. So I go to the actions here. And what I see here is then the corresponding code function, which is being executed when such an event is raised. And as I mentioned, I can create manual events using the standard user interface. And we will come back to that quite soon, since there are two ways for creating that. But I can here define which user interface controls. Why does a string show? Yeah, makes sense. Should be used here. This is the wrong one. So we go for that. And we can even hear the remark priority control and the description. And let's create that now. So, and we have created a remark type. Let's have a closer look at the code function I have assigned to that manual event type. So these are the attributes being handed over: the asset object, the event object, then the asset handler. This is a function, an object I can use for interacting with the system. So I can use the create document function provided for the asset handler, and I hand over the asset ID, the type of document I want to create, and the event here. And by the way, you might have wondered why I have not created a status property for our manual event. The reason is that all new manual events we will assign the status open to. So, and using that code function here, when such a manual event is raised, will always create a document, a remark document. Before a manual event type can be used, two things need to be done. First, this manual event type needs to be assigned to specific asset types, or here as named in our standard user interface, system and component types. So we will go for the Bruma 3000, for example here, go to event types and select it. Same I will do on the TXR. So that defines that that specific manual event type is assigned to the asset type, and therefore events of that type can be fired against that asset type. Second is that I need to specify which roles should have access to those events. I take here the service technician. And I would say a service technician should be able to read such event types. So he should be able to see who has created it. And now we are ready to go and can create events. Manual events can be created in two ways. One is just available for administrators. This is what I will show you first. Second is an approach using so-named apps, and that is the usual way of creating manual events. But first, let's go here. So I've already filtered here our two injection molding machines. Can also go for all. And let's pick one. Go to events. And you see now here the event types assigned to the respective asset type available. So clicking here, I see the user interface controls I have assigned to that manual event. Pick an urgency and say needs to be repaired. Save it. And you see now that this manual event here had been created. And also important aspect, it is not deletable, not even by an administrator. And that is for documenting safely who has done which change on the document or on the asset here in that case, not on the document, who has raised which manual events. Those events here will automatically be deleted if I have decided for a maximum lifetime in days, what I had shown you before, or they will not even get created if I decide to not save the events. In that case here, I have said I want to save the events. I haven't even specified a lifetime of this event. So they will sum up and never be deleted as long as that is not being changed. Now let's see what happens in the document section when I go for the remarks. And here that document now had been created. And I see it's the admin who has created this. It's the urgency is urgent. What I see here, that's a bit ugly. That's the specifics of just the text of the tag. So if I want to have that represented in a specific language, it's easy to be done. In that case here, the user interface control needs a bit improvement. So, but as you see, the manual event has been successfully processed and everything is as it should be. So what is now the other approach? Since as said, this is just available here for administrators. If I go to the systems components overview here and I open one of the assets, I don't see a menu item for adding an event. Let's talk about apps. Often it's better to practically show something instead of doing a long theoretical explanation. Therefore, I want to show you how an app works. I have prepared some apps here for the demonstration. And first is that I need to assign an app to a specific role. I will go here. No, not pick it for the dashboard apps, but why not? I can pick it for both. Then I can also show you what a dashboard app means in contradiction to a usual app. And you see here, I can assign apps to both. And next is that I want to create a new user, a service technician, and I name it technician 1. This is a service technician. And the properties is it's Smith, Eddie, and site is Atlanta. So now we have our service technician created, and I will log out from this screen here as an administrator and re-log in as our technician 1. Let's see what happens then. I will log in as the service technician now. First, what you see, the application comes up in German. This is since German is in that project here specified as the default. Can be changed. The default can be changed to English, to whatever language you want. So let's switch now here to English. And then you see here something which is an app. An app is a subcomponent in a user interface written in the Vue language. It's not a language. Vue is a JavaScript framework. So it's written using the Vue 3 JavaScript framework, but we don't see any remarks. And if we go here to the systems and components, we just see a subset of systems and components. And that's simply since the role of the service technician has just limited access. First, it just sees some of the robots. Second, it just sees the injection molding machines of the site being assigned to the respective user. You might have seen the service technician 1 has Atlanta assigned. And when I go here, I see Atlanta. I don't see the injection molding machines assigned to Munich. But the remark documents we had created, these were for the other injection molding machine of the type Bruma 3000 assigned to Munich. So let's fix that. We will log in here as the administrator again and create another service technician assigned to Munich. Let's give it a German name. And it's assigned to Munich. So now we have done that. Let's log out. Let's re-log in. This time as technician 2. So first let's switch to English, and what you see here now, that is this remarks app. And what it is showing, it shows all remarks in status open, and if they are marked as urgent, then they get displayed here in red. And I can double click on it and I see then here the content of the remark document, and if I close, I would change the status to closed. But for doing that, I want to do two things. First, we need to add another manual event, a closing event. But before doing that, I want to give you some insights on the coding, how an app can be coded. In the source code folder of the standard UI of objects in the box, there is another folder, customizing. If I go in here, I see apps and also UI controls and UI objects. So this is all about customizing UI objects, UI controls, apps. I go to apps, to the components, and here we find the remarks app. So how that's being structured, if you make yourself a bit familiar with Vue 3, the JavaScript framework, you will easily understand what's being done here. So that is what you see in the user interface. Important is that it takes two props, an asset handler and a document handler here. And it's also of importance to see that finally, when closing, we want to create another manual event of type close remark, and the data I will hand over here is a doc ID, and that is the identifier of the remark document to be closed. So what I have to do now is I have to create that close remark manual event type and a property doc ID, and then I think we are already ready to go, since the processing of that will be done by a code function that I also can show you here in the event action section. You see here then when such an event is coming, it will update a document with that ID, with the doc ID, and set us to status close. So let's see if that works. So I have now created a second frame in my browser here. The other one we will leave open. And here I will log in as administrator again. Go to the event sections, create a manual event. This name has to match, since that is being used for assigning the proper manual event type in the app. So, and that's already it. We don't need to add user interface controls, since we do not want to raise that manually. And as an action, close remark. So now we have both manual events created, the create remark and the close remark, and we can see what happens in the system if we create new remarks and if we then close those remarks here in the second application. There is one thing I forgot. We need to add that manual event type here to the allowed manual events for the respective asset type. So save that, and I go now to my systems and components. Let's pick, was it this here? Yeah, let's pick that, and let's go to events and create another manual event. And I select here task necessary. Please have a look. Save that. And we're now going to the document section. We see that there is a second remark document created now. And let's just move over here. I think it will take some time, and then it should update also here that we see the new remark appearing. So now it's there, and we can go create another event here. We'll this time set the urgency to for information. So also here it takes some time till the event is processed. You see, now it's there. Jumping over, also here, this frequency for the refresh is set to 30 seconds, and we see it's here again. By the way, you might have already recognized I have slightly changed the urgency status for that event or for the remarks from medium and low to task necessary and information. I think that makes more sense. And now we can see what happens when we go closing an event. Sorry for that, not the event, but the remark is what I want to close. I push close here, but nothing happens. The reason is quite simple. The current user, the role of the current user, is not authorized for raising manual events of that type. So I have to go here to my service technician, and I have to tell him that for the close remark, I authorize that user to create close remark manual events. Let's try again. And you see now the respective remark has been closed, and in the next run of this refresh here, as you saw, it's now disappearing since that remark is closed. So I hope that gave you a glimpse of understanding on how apps and manual events correspond to each other, and also what I just explained, that the user needs to have certain access privileges to use certain apps, that needs to be considered when implementing the app, when implementing the project. Before I start explaining the concept of triggered events, I want to talk a bit more about apps. So what I already explained, apps can be shown as dashboard apps or in the apps section directly. You can show the same app like it is here in both places. Usually that doesn't make that much of sense, but it's possible. No? It can be configured for the role. But what we did with that app here, that we manipulated documents, that makes a lot of sense, but it's not the only use case of apps. I want to show you something completely different, and therefore I go to the role of the service technician, and here we'll pick the machine status just as a dashboard app. Let's go save it, and let's then here log out and re-log in. So what you see now here is that machine status app, which gives an overview about the status of the injection molding machines as well as the installed robots. So here is the injection molding machine, and below there are the installed robots. We can also go testing that out with Technician 1, where we then see the systems and components installed on the other side. Here it's the Bruma 3000 A241 with having the 3D robot installed, and that is stopped. So here when I wrote that app, I've decided that stopped components will be shown in gray. Components with a mail function or need to be repaired will be shown in red. So stuff can have an immediate overview, and you see it's also reloading frequently so that always the most current status is available. And when talking about triggered events, you will even see how that can be used here in conjunction with the triggered event, since whenever an event occurs which results in changing the machine status or the component status, it will be immediately shown here. So apps are not just meaningful for manipulating documents or things like that. They can be used in a broad variety to manipulate, to see the status of the ecosystem. We will leave that here as it is and just go talking about triggered events. So, what is that? In most scenarios, objects in the box will not be used as an isolated application, but will be integrated in an ecosystem where other systems, so hardware or sensors or other applications, want to interact with objects in the box. So interacting can mean two different things. On one hand, it can mean sending events, and that is what we will talk about in a second. It's covered by the triggered event mechanism. Second is requesting or sending arbitrary information. That's what's being covered by services. I will talk about services then afterwards. So what is a triggered event? The idea of a triggered event is the following. Triggered events are always issued from outside objects in the box. It's not possible to raise a triggered event from inside. When I want it from inside, I have to use a manual event. Triggered events will be issued by authorized external parties, and they authorize via the mechanism of an event issuer. So an event issuer, that is in principle a technical user having a secret assigned, and using that secret he can apply for getting a token, an authorization token issued. That token then can be used for raising a triggered event using a dedicated API. And inside objects in the box, then the following will happen. First, it will be checked if the request was authorized. So is the authorization token valid? And second, was the issuer authorized to raise that specific type of triggered event? Second is then the event structure itself will be evaluated, validated. If it's a valid structure for that type of triggered event the issuer is claiming to send an event for, then it will be determined which kind of assets are impacted, since at the end a triggered event always is raised against one or more assets. And last step is then to apply a certain action on those assets being identified as targets. So how that works in reality, I will show you now in practice here by creating a triggered event type. Let's start with the event validation. You see it here. When the code function returns true, everything is fine. If it returns false, the processing will be interrupted since the event validation failed. So, and as you see here, the validation in that case is quite simple. If the event contains a serial number, a code, and a value, it proceeds. Next is the target determination. What is about determining the asset being impacted by the event? And in this case here, you see also it's quite simple. In case the serial number provided by the event is contained in here or here, so it's one of the known serial numbers, the respective asset type is assigned, and then based on the serial number, the corresponding asset is being determined. And what you see is that the asset type at the end is an array. That means it can be multiple asset types being influenced here. So it's not a must that it's just about one asset type. The asset handler search is able to consume multiple asset types. And also important, the return value here is always an array, since that means it can be multiple assets. In our project here, multiple systems and components being impacted by that event. So it's not like with the manual event that there is a one-to-one relationship. Here there is a one-to-many relationship between an event and the assets. So finally then, on all the assets being determined as target assets, the following happens. If the event code is 500.1 or 500.2, which in our example scenario here means it's an error that happened that we need to handle, then a remark is added to the remark field of the asset, and the asset is then being updated with the status defect and the new remark, and the remark document is created, assigned to that asset with the specific information and the status urgent. So this here, that service handler, I can just cut. This is what we will talk about later, and it's also not of relevance here. So I think we are done, and we can now try it out. But before we can do that, we need to take care about one thing more, and that is the event issuer. So an event issuer is a kind of a technical user. It comes with a name. I will name it issuer1 here. And it has a secret. Usually that should be a long string. I will just make it simple here. And it's necessary to specify which event types this event issuer is allowed to raise. In our case, it's the machine events. Now I will go for trying out to issue a triggered event using Postman. The first two APIs are important for us for issuing a triggered event. The other ones are about services. That's what's coming next. For raising a triggered event, as already explained, first I need to determine a valid authentication token. So this one here is an old one. I will just send the request, and you see now a new auth token is generated. What I have provided as input is the name of the event issuer and the secret. And for sure, I need to know the endpoint, the authenticate event issuer endpoint provided by the auth service, and also how to call the auth service. So in my test environment here, it's on the local host on the 3003 socket. Now I can grab that token and put it in here as the authorization header property in the next request. And that is about issuing the request, the triggered event itself. So here the payload is the name of the triggered event type, machine event, and the event itself. So let's see what happens if I raise that now. Status okay. So it's now on its way to be processed. Let's go back to the application and see what happens there. Let's jump over to the Service Technician login. And what you see here, suddenly the mission status of the BR3000 A921 had changed to defect, and another urgent remark document had been created. And you see here, it's exactly in what we expected. So it's a bit malformed here, but don't matter. So this is how triggered events work. But what is now when one from external wants to retrieve certain data from objects in the box, or want to issue some information which are not clearly related to an asset from whatever reasons? Also for that there is a solution, and that's services. The idea of services is a bit similar to triggered events, but just a bit. It's not the same. So here the idea is that objects in the box can offer services, which at the end is an API endpoint with a specific typing. So I always use the same API endpoint when I want to consume a service, but I specify which type of service I want to use here. And the ones being allowed to use that service, that's being specified by service consumer. So a service consumer is really a bit similar to an event issuer. A service itself is not tightly bound to an asset or a document or something like that. What object in the box does when a specific service is called fully depends on the corresponding code function implementation. So there might be scenarios where a service is receiving data and returning data. There might be a service where no data are provided at all, but just returned. Might be a rare case, but it's possible. And there might be scenarios where a service just receives data, internally does something with these data, and is not returning something at all. So a service at the end is the execution of a code function fulfilling a certain business case. So let's create a service, and that is also very easy going here. A service consists of a service name. Here I will call it my service, and I need to assign a service code function. These are just test scenarios. Let's go for service 1, and I will create it. Next step is then to create service consumer, and same story then for the event issuer. The service consumer needs to have a name, a secret, and services assigned. So that defines which of the services such a service consumer, by the way, is allowed to call. So we have assigned here the service 1. Let's have a look what that service 1 does. It's not rocket science here, since I said it's just an example scenario, but it might give you a glimpse how that works. So this is the code function representing service 1. You see the payload that I want to transfer to the respective code function, to the service, is provided using the first argument here, the args argument. Then an asset handler is available so that I can interact with assets based on that, and context. And by the way, context is now named tools. context would also work, but it is tools. What tools are, I will also explain a bit more in a minute. And then I just, in that case here, return here an hi world. And we can easily test that out using Postman again. So same story then for the triggered events. First, I need to apply for an authentication token. In that case, I need to call that authenticate service consumer API. And as a payload, it's necessary to provide the service consumer name and the corresponding secret. So I get here my token again. And by the way, the lifetime of that token, that's being configurable on project scope. So it's possible to determine the lifetime from the token itself. And if a token expired before calling that API, the consumer needs to apply for another auth token. It's the same for the event issuer. I will go here and put in my token again. Go back. And what you see here, it's really simple in that case. It's the name of my service I want to consume. And the arguments, in that case, it's an empty JSON structure. And when I call that, let's see what happens. So this is what we get back. The data property contains the payload of my response. You know, that can be anything, that can be more complex structure. So here I'm completely free. As said, it can also be empty. And that is what then the consumer can use for further working. If there is anything he wants to do with, a lot of scenarios might also just be about sending over some data to the objects in the box application and not getting anything back. Last point I want to tackle when talking about all these code function related functionalities of objects in the box is scheduled functions. Let's take a scenario where a maintenance plan is assigned to each of the assets, and the system should check if maintenance is overdue, and in case yes it is, then a maintenance document or something like that should be created, and perhaps management should be informed that system maintenance needs to be done. So that creates the challenge that frequently it needs to be checked if maintenance is overdue. And exactly that is what can be done using scheduled functions. At the end, scheduled functions is nothing more than a code function, a specific code function, which is specific schedule. And one of the possible schedules is like that. How a schedule is created, you see here in the documentation of the cron package. So there is a specific syntax for that. And what I'm about to specify here, that is that this code function should be executed all 10 seconds. Okay, when it is now about checking maintenance cycle, that would be more on a daily base or weekly or something like that. But for test purpose, let's keep it as it is here. So the monitor maintenance cycles code function will be executed all 10 seconds. I will create it. And by the way, code functions, scheduled code functions can be activated and deactivated. So if it deactivated will no longer be executed, but still be in the system, I can reactivate. So let's create. We have done that. And now we can go to the source code and also show what's happening with that scheduled code function. Since I don't have implemented all the logic and filled all the documents which would be necessary for that meaningful process to determine if a maintenance is overdue, I have just commented that out here in that code function, so you can read through that comment if you're interested in how that would work with a fully configured project scenario. And for the test here, I have just added that console log output, and you see here below how it's working. So it's being executed regularly all 10 seconds. And if I would remove this comment here, then it would try to resolve that code here all 10 seconds. And yeah, that is how it works. It's no rocket science, but it's very meaningful in scenario that I want to frequently check something in my system or raise some system activities frequently. That could also be about cleaning up some things frequently. So the range of use cases, I think it's very broad here. So finally, before coming to the end on describing code function related things, I want to raise your awareness on one specific detail. Let's pick that code function here. As one of the arguments, you quite often see here tools, and that has a specific idea behind. By default, there is just one object available that you can work with in a code function, and that is the asset handler. But from time to time, it might be meaningful to provide other tools to the implementer of a code function on a project base. So especially when it is about dynamic creation of code functions, I might want to limit the abilities of accessing system capabilities here in my project, and therefore I can hand over dedicated tools, meaning dedicated objects or functions, to the code function that can be used then in here. And when I go to the tools section here in my source code, you see that there are dedicated tools specified, and I can register those tools for action related code functions, event, scheduler, and service related ones. So, and how it works is that what's being exported here, that will be available inside the code function. So action tools, this means that whenever an event action is executed, in the tools argument of that event action, an HTTP handler and a global data handler in that case would be available. And in other projects, that can be something completely different. It needs to be implemented and stored here in the source code stack. So this is just exemplary, but it might make sense. In other scenarios, one can delete it, one can add something here. But the underlying idea is to provide certain tools inside code functions so that on one hand I can regulate which functionality is available in a code function, especially for dynamically created code functions. And on the other hand, I can provide tools as necessary. The last aspect I want to explain here in that objects in the box overview is the handling of so-named anonymous users. So what is an anonymous user? We see here a predefined role, that underscore anonymous underscore. And that's for use cases where we want to grant access to certain objects in the box functionalities by using an app for users being not authenticated. So they should be able to go to the website of Objects in the Box or to a certain service, and they should be able to retrieve some of the information. And how that internally works is that when a user accesses Objects in the Box without being authenticated, he gets a so-named anonymous user token applied, and that has automatically the anonymous role applied. What we can do now, for example, is to grant that anonymous role access to certain specific apps. In my case, I have taken here the Remarks app. That might not be the best one, since for sure in reality I do not want to get access to all the system remarks to whomever, since I want to take some of the remarks private for sure. Important is also, when I do that, I need to grant specific access privileges to that anonymous role so that the specific app, as I already explained for apps in general, can be used. But let's keep it as an example. So I have done that here. And what I can do now is I can log out, for example. And when I'm re-logging in, I see here in the standard user interface anonymous apps. When I click on that, then Objects in the Box is used in an anonymous mode. Let's here go for English. I can log in, since I'm not logged in, but I have access to one or more apps. In that case, as I defined, to the Remarks app, and I see all those Remarks documents here. For sure, in reality, I want to keep the usage of anonymous scenarios very careful. I do not want to open here any security issues, but let's take the example. I have some people which are temporarily working in my company and which should get access to certain task information. So they come in the morning. I do not want to onboard, offboard them, but I want to grant them access to an overview of at least certain tasks they might have to do. So I can here use the anonymous scenario, and that might lower the burden for the system management in general. Yeah, and that's it. We are at the end of the Objects in the Box introduction. Frankly said, the introduction became quite longer than I expected, but yeah, Objects in the Box, I think, provides a lot of meaningful functionality. Just try it out, read through the user manuals, download the application, and if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm really looking forward to whether people are interested in using Objects in the Box for their scenario. And for sure, that will not be the end of the story. That is the first public release. The platform is already in use in some private scenarios, but I'm looking forward to enhancing with even more capabilities, also for sure considering AI use cases, which I could imagine there is also something very meaningful that Object in the Box could be used for in an agentic approach, but that's just one aspect. So feel free to get in touch with me. Feel free to try it out, to give hints, to find some bugs. For sure, there will still be some bugs in. And I wish you a great time.